In the world of the gods, the goddess of healing, Rista, is chosen to save a world of S-rank difficulty, and because it is a very difficult level, she ends up being very nervous. To choose the hero who will lead this mission, she examines a list of candidates from Japan, as they are already accustomed to stories of young people summoned from other worlds. This way, they get the idea quickly. After seeing many candidate resumes, she gets nervous and falls off her chair, and a resume with very high statistics falls in her face, and she decides to call on this candidate. Being happy with the hero's strength, she prepares the summoning circle and brings him to the world of the gods. Upon seeing the hero, she falls in love and begins to fantasize about a love story, but remembers that relationships between gods and humans are prohibited. When introducing herself to the hero, she expects him to be enchanted with her, but Seiya, the hero, finds the goddess strange. Shocked by the hero's speech, she tries to maintain her composure as a goddess, but the hero begins to look around and says that if she really is a goddess, she could solve the problem herself. She explains that the rule is that human worlds have to be saved by humans. He says that he contests the rule and that it is selfish to force him to go save other worlds. The goddess gets angrier and tries to continue the standard invocation explanation. She tells him to say status to see his data, and he says properties, and she gets scared that he opened a menu. Seiya says her crazy story starts to make sense, and she says he's been rude to a goddess. After begging him to say status, she explains how strong Seiya is, and he asks what happens if he dies. She says that he returns to Earth, but he says he doesn't know if he believes, so she opens the portal to the world to be saved, and he refuses to go. She tries to convince him to go, saying that she will help him, will be by his side, and will heal him. He says that the help must not be good and that she won't be able to do much in this world. She gets very nervous, and when he stops her, saying that he has one condition to go, she starts to think that the hero wants a relationship with her. But the condition is that he prepares himself before going into this world. At that moment, she remembers the message on his file said, "The personality of impulsive caution." Yes, this is the story of the hero, who is always super prepared for any situation. We see the goddess Rista complaining about Seiya to the goddess Arya. The goddess Arya reminds Rista of her obligation to support the hero, and Rista rushes to find resources for Seiya to continue his training. The goddess brought food to the hero, and he decides not to accept her food because she is a stranger and tells her to eat it first to check if it is not poisoned. After furnishing the hero's room with magic, she leaves a doll of hers with him as a means of communication. After a week of waiting for the hero to call her, she receives the call and runs to see him, and when she sees Seiya without a shirt, she even gets a nosebleed. When looking at his attributes, he leveled up to level 15 and got XP boosting skills and special moves. The hero would like to maximize his level before going to the world he is going to save, but they both agree that it is inefficient to train and decide to go save the world. Upon arriving in the new world, they walk through a country town. The protagonist says that the goddess's clothes are flashy, and she says that she disguised her clothes with magic. The protagonist is suspicious of the city's citizens if they are not shapeshifters or criminals, and a girl talks to them and they ask for information on where the city's armor shop is. In the store, the protagonist chooses steel armor but asks for 3 copies of it. The goddess says he doesn't need 3, but he says yes. The first is for use, the second is the reserve, and the third is the reserve of is the reserve, in case there is a problem with the reserve. The goddess says his caution is pathological, and she decides to choose his equipment. And with the coins he had left, he bought a huge amount of cures and antidotes. The goddess says there are no strong monsters in the region, and the child appears again, confirming this. Soon after, her father appears, and we see that the goddess and the hero go to hunt some monsters. A slime appears, and the goddess says they are monsters that any adult can beat with a club. And when she looks at the hero, he is launching a skill against the slime. The skill opens a crater, and the goddess says it is too much. He tells her that slime might still be alive and launches a series of consecutive skills at the same location. The goddess asks if he doesn't have the evaluation skill. He says he has it and used it, and he saw only 1 digit in the attributes. She says that there was no reason for him to exaggerate the attack, and he responds that the visible data is not everything. Then a sinister aura occurs, and one of the demon lord's commanders appears. The goddess is surprised by the fact that she is in an initial city, and the villain says that heroes normally appear in these cities, so she will defeat them before they become strong. After saying that the demon lord is wary of the appearance of heroes, the villain says she will eliminate the protagonist, and the goddess evaluates her status, and she is at very high levels. When the goddess goes to ask the hero what to do, he is already running. The villain says the hero is fascinating and goes after him. When she is close enough to get it right, the protagonist makes a smokescreen with the items he bought in the city and asks the goddess to open a portal to the world of the gods. When the protagonist and the goddess were arriving at the portal, the villain tries to hit the goddess, who trips over the protagonist's backpack, which releases fire magic in the villain's face, and the two go through the portal with the goddess falling on top of the protagonist. Then, upon arriving in the world of the gods, the hero takes the goddess off of him by throwing her against the wall and decides to go back to training, as the villain is many times stronger than the slime. After 2 days of waiting for a sign from the protagonist, the goddess decides to look at the world they are going to save with a crystal ball, and as she looks, the villain realizes and says that she will destroy the city they were in if they don't show up. The goddess is terrified by the elimination of one of the city's residents and goes to meet the hero, and when saying that the villain will kill one person every 10 minutes, the protagonist asks what the reason is for the passage of time between the worlds. The ratio is 100 to 1, with 10 minutes in the world they will save being the equivalent of 16 hours in the world of the gods. The protagonist decides to train with the time he has left. The goddess tells them to go immediately, and the two argue. Upon seeing that the protagonist did not express distress over the little girl they had found to be in danger, the goddess says she made a mistake in summoning him. After saying that he is a fearful and the worst hero, she almost starts crying, and when she is about to leave, the protagonist says that he cannot afford to die because if he is defeated, the city will be destroyed and then the whole world. The goddess spies on the hero's status, and he has risen several levels in these days of training. Saying that it's completely ready, the goddess says she's going to open a portal in the center of the city. The protagonist hits her on the head, calls her stupid, and says that the villain will eliminate the guy the moment she sees them coming, so she opens the portal far away. When the villain was going to eliminate the guy, the protagonist appeared, attacking a wind blade. The villain dodged and said that it was the only sneak attack he would have, and the protagonist responded that the objective was never to hit her but to free the girl's father. He was released and soon ran away with his daughter. The villain is surprised. She looks at the protagonist's status, and despite his general level being lower, his skill level surpasses hers, and the goddess is boasting about his status, so the villain releases a transformation, becomes huge, and all of her attributes increase. She makes a strong attack, and the protagonist handles it well, even with apparently lesser attributes, and the goddess is happy about that, but soon after the villain decides to use a special curse technique, she sticks her sword in herself, and a bizarre being emerges from it. The goddess begins to tremble and says that the monster is already stronger than demon lords from D-rank worlds. The bizarre monster attacks the protagonist with everything and breaks the floor. The goddess thinks it is the end of the hero and that she misjudged the difficulty of the world. But when the dust settles, the protagonist is defending the blow with one arm. The goddess and the monster are surprised, thinking it is impossible. The goddess concludes that the protagonist has the ability to present false statuses and tries to see the original statuses. After trying hard to see the status, almost bulging her eyes, she sees that, in fact, the protagonist is 10 times stronger than the villain. After being completely surprised by how cautious the protagonist is, we see the monster making a huge sphere of energy to destroy the city, and then the protagonist appears next to her and slices the monster, which explodes into flames in the air. The goddess, who was watching, jumps on the protagonist and makes a perverted face when she smells him, and the protagonist sulks at her, saying that she looks sick. The goddess asks why he uses the ability to hide status even with her, and he says that it is so that no one discovers his power, either by her telling or by mind reading. Then the townspeople appear, the women are interested in him, and the guys are interested in the goddess. The protagonist refuses the invitation to dinner and begins to collect the remains of the villain, who became a monster. In this, he performs a series of fire spells until he stops, concentrates, and uses a hidden ability that sets the entire city on fire. The goddess puts out a citizen's fire, and we see that the person in charge of the city is begging him to leave. On the way, the father of the girl who was saved by the protagonist appears, thanks them, and gives money to help on the journey. The protagonist asks for more, and the goddess calls the protagonist sick. After they say goodbye, the goddess and the protagonist begin to argue about how the adventure will continue. The goddess wants to go to the next city, the protagonist wants to go to the world of the gods, and after discovering that she cannot provide him with better armor with her power of creation, he says that its value is the same as that of an herb medicinal. In the world of the gods, Rista talks to Arya, complaining about the hero who is training non-stop. Rista wants to increase her level, and reach the goddess Arya, and at that moment, there are quotes from Arya about one of the worlds she couldn't save because of her mistake. The matter ends, and soon after the protagonist appears. Upon seeing him, Arya drops the kettle she was holding and goes to talk to him. Rista calls the protagonist Goddess Nizer. Arya asks the protagonist why he is in such a hurry, and he says he can't gain more levels with training. Rista celebrates and plays dumb. Rista presents the protagonist's solution: defeat monsters. Arya suggests that he train with the gods who live there. Then Seduces is introduced, and Rista complains that they are even further away from a normal adventure. Seduces is convinced by Arya to train the protagonist, and he warns him that his training is extremely demanding and that no human would be able to resist. The protagonist says he won't let the god give up halfway through, and when the god is about to complain about his stance, the protagonist walks and tells them to start. Rista is scared by the protagonist's posture. But he thinks that Seduces will shake the protagonist's confidence, and after an exchange of blows, one day passes. Rista meets Seduces in the refectory of the gods, and he says that the protagonist has more courage than he expected. Another day passes, and Rista meets Seduces again, but now he looks scared. He says that the protagonist has evolved a lot, and the god says he wanted to use his true power, but he talks about the rule of the world of gods, which does not allow the use of divine power against humans. And then she hears the god complain about not being able to beat the protagonist. On the third day, she meets Seduces, and he is completely sad. When she tries to find out more about the training, he screams and leaves. On the fourth day, she finds Seduces hiding from the protagonist and complaining that the protagonist is unstoppable in training, and during his crying, the protagonist finds him. After trying to make an excuse, he freaks out and throws his sword away, a detail that he is known for using his divine sword technique. Crying, he is dragged to training by the protagonist. Rista is going to have a meeting with a superior goddess, and in this meeting, we discover that humans can reincarnate as gods, and their characteristics as humans affect their divine characteristics, despite having no memories of their past lives. The superior goddess orders them to go immediately to the next city, and through Rista's thoughts, we discover that the superior goddess has the power to prophesy the future. Rista goes after the hero, and when she arrives at the training site, we see the god being beaten by the hero, and he says that this is part of the training. Rista says they need to leave, and the hero says he's perfectly ready. Upon arriving in the world, the townspeople are leaving and warn that an army of undead is approaching. The protagonist asks what the best approach is to defeat them, and the goddess says fire magic and holy water. After trying to buy all the holy water, they go to the church and find the hero's journey partners, who are dragon descendants. The priest bows to greet the hero, and the hero throws holy water at the priest. Everyone is about to criticize the protagonist, but then the priest begins to dissolve, and it is revealed that he is an undead. The undead begins to speak, and when the goddess asks the protagonist to help, he says that he has already incapacitated him, and then the undead dismounts. And the dragon's descendants say they couldn't see him or draw his sword, and the goddess thinks the same thing. When the goddess asks how she discovered that the priest was undead, he just threw holy water as a precaution. And when he says he's going to clean up the remains of the undead, the goddess starts running and warns everyone to run. When he casts high-level fire magic, the church is destroyed. The nun fainted, and the dragon's descendants went to talk to him, and then the protagonist threw holy water on everyone, even the goddess. The dragon descendants have, according to the goddess, 1/100th of the protagonist's power, and before she begins to convince the protagonist, he says that he does not need them as companions. After that, the protagonist says that they can't even sense danger, and the city guards arrive. After speaking with the nun who had fainted, the knights discover the identities of the goddess and the hero. When they ask for help, the protagonist asks how much they will pay to eliminate the undead horde. The goddess says this is not the time to ask for money, and he says it is for a special skill. The guard offers help, but he refuses, tells the dragon descendants to stay in the city, and when the goddess questions him, he says that if they go, they will die in vain and that he doesn't even need her help and flies away. The goddess gets very angry, uses a special resource that should be used in emergencies to get the power to fly, and goes after the hero. When she approaches him, he speeds up, and she can't catch up. When her head was down, he came back, took her hand, and they started flying together. At the moment, her imagination is idealizing a romance. He warns her that he's going to speed up, and she can barely handle the speed. The protagonist positions himself at a safe distance from the troop of undead marching into the city and launches a meteor attack on the troop. The meteor impact vaporized the entire area in a huge explosion, turning the green field into a volcanic scene. The goddess admits that the protagonist should be enough to defeat the demon lord, and after he launches the second meteor attack, he feels a lack of mana but soon says that he still has 90% of his mana reserve. In the city of Elyulu, the dragon girl informs the goddess of the disappearance of Mash, the dragon boy. When the goddess goes to the hero's room, he is synthesizing new swords, and she is surprised by the quality of the sword. The secret is that he used a catalyst, her hair that he had picked up around her room. While he was requesting more hair for her, an order arrived. A mirror. The reflection shows Mash, the dragon boy who had disappeared, and a skull appears. He is one of the 4 high-ranking servants of the demon lord. The skull gives a speech about how difficult it is to gather so many undead and says that he will get rid of Mash at that moment. So the protagonist tells the goddess to open a portal to the divine kingdom and prepares a sword attack. The skull says that the hero cannot hit him through the mirror, but when the protagonist launches his attack, the skull loses its hand. He used the photon sword, which cuts between dimensions. The protagonist enters the portal with the goddess Rista, takes advantage of the difference in the passage of time, and asks the superior goddess to open a portal where Mash is, despite warning that the gods can't help humans much, but she do. The protagonist says that the moment he leaves the portal, he will hit the skull, and he does. Rista heals Mash and unties him. The protagonist begins to face a ghost made of fire, with immunity to all types of weapons and all types of magic, except ice magic. As a standard characteristic of a villain, the skull tells the protagonist step by step how to defeat the monster, thinking that the protagonist has no way to defeat it. After the skull boasts that he theorized and planned several monsters for each situation, the protagonist says that this was ordinary. The skull says that the protagonist cannot beat the monster with his rudimentary preparation, and the protagonist shows that his preparation is not rudimentary. Saying that he is perfectly prepared, he throws a punch with the necessary skill to destabilize the monster, showing that he has preparation for skills without the sword as well. When exchanging punches with the monster, the punch freezes, and when asked how he has this attribute, which is the opposite of his natural attribute, the protagonist says that he synthesized bracelets of all attributes as well as reserve bracelets. The protagonist finishes the monster with a sword and fire attack. The goddess Rista calls him a strong and perfect warrior. The protagonist eliminates the traces of the skull's existence, and the goddess walks away with Mash. Rista is taking care of the dragon's descendants when the protagonist arrives and says that they will carry his luggage. Elyalou celebrates joining the group, while Mash says that he learned from the situation and asks to be trained by the protagonist. Mash tells about his and the Elyalou's origins, saying that from the place they came from, there was a legend that when they joined the hero, they should return, break the seal, and get a weapon capable of eliminating the demon lord. Rista tells them to start the adventure, but the protagonist makes everyone go to the world of the gods. In the cantina, they find Seduces making cakes. Seduces offers the protagonist a cake, but he refuses and says it is disgusting. The hero says he doesn't care about his hobbies and that he came for training. Seduces is terrified but cheers up when he discovers that he will train with Mash and not with the protagonist. Rista says he's disgusting, and she won't pity him anymore. Elyalou goes to train with the fire goddess, who compliments the dragon girl's red hair. The protagonist says that now he has to find someone to train him, and Rista says that it's as if the protagonist had left other people to take care of his children. Rista bumps into the goddess of destruction, Valkyria, who grabs her by the neck and then mocks and harasses her. The protagonist worries about Rista and says that the exhibitionist Valkyrie is very powerful. Rista says that she is the strongest in that place and that any human who spoke to her would die. In this, the protagonist is insulting her and asking to be trained by her. Valkyria grabs the protagonist by the collar and says that she will break the protagonist in half if she continues with this attitude. The hero tells her to go ahead, and Rista despairs. Arya appears, asking the goddess of destruction to calm down and resolve the situation. Arya introduces another goddess for the protagonist to train, the goddess of war, Adenila, which has a pale and untidy appearance. Rista begins to think about negative things about the goddess of war, and the protagonist speaks, leaving Rista's mouth open. Adenila agrees to train the protagonist and begins to test him. She says she will teach divine speed skills and eternal sword, abilities that go beyond human limits. Rista is scared by the goddess of war, thinking it better to reconsider when the protagonist accepts. Rista thinks that he wasn't careful. They begin training. On the first day, we see that Mash is being trained by Seduces. Rista, bringing food to the protagonist, finds the goddess of war sitting on the floor, says that she is resting while the protagonist continues to practice, and starts to laugh and say that she has never seen a hero like that. The protagonist appears and calls the goddess of war to continue training, so she blushes and follows him. On day 2, we see the protagonist and Mash eating together. Rista tries to start a conversation, but the hero soon leaves. She asks Mash what is happening, who tells the commandments of caudalism, to doubt everything, even what you see. The goddess of war appears in a pink dress, and Rista asks what happened. Adenila says she was embarrassed to see the hero like that. The protagonist won the heart of the goddess. Rista thinks that the protagonist must have the goddessnizer skill, so she tells the goddess that they are going back to the fantasy world and asks if the protagonist can learn the skill later. But the protagonist has already learned. He is called talented by the goddess of war, who makes a depraved face. On the third day, we see that Mash has increased her level. Elyalou appears sad, and the goddess who trained her tells Rista that she has no talent. The entire group meets with the protagonist, who is waiting for the goddess of war, who appears to be another person, or rather, another goddess, being all happy, grabs the protagonist and asks to go along with him. The protagonist says he is grateful for the training but refuses, leaves, and asks Rista to open a portal. The goddess of war freaks out and starts attacking whoever is nearby. Meanwhile, the protagonist is saying that he is perfectly prepared, and Rista is saying that it's not time for his catchphrase. In the other world, they walk to the dragon's hideout, while Elyalou tries to perform magic to help in battle. The protagonist says their job is to carry bags, not fight. A wild monster appears, Mash prepares to show his power, and the protagonist's automatic phoenix defeats the monster. Other monsters begin to appear. Elyalou and Mash try, but the protagonist's magic defeats the monsters before they can make the first attack, and it leaves them discouraged. Rista is impressed and tries to see the protagonist's status. She tries hard, fails, and receives an automatic attack from the protagonist. He keeps crying with a headache. They arrive at a dwarven village, and the protagonist is ready to eliminate everyone, but Rista stops him, saying that they are peaceful. When purchasing equipment, Mash already shows himself to be a cautious disciple, saying a large amount, and the protagonist increases this amount 10 times. Upon finding the seal, the protagonist shows the eternal sword technique he learned and destroys the seal, making his companions feel useless. In the room they entered, a portal lit up, and a voice told them to go to the magic circle, which would take them to the village of dragons, where they would receive the legendary sword. The goddess gets excited, but the protagonist stops her, puts a lizard in the circle, and says they are ready. The lizard disappears, the voice says that the animal appeared there, the animal returns and the protagonist analyzes it. Upon realizing that it is not a trap, they go to the village, where they are welcomed by the humanoid dragon, get to know the village, and are introduced to the monarch of that place. The monarch unlocks Mash's draconic transformation ability, which increases his stats 10 times. Elialu asks for the ability, and at that moment, the monarch tells her that she will become Exasian, sacrificing herself. Everyone is surprised and rejects the idea of her sacrificing herself. The monarch tells of the chaos the world is in, with the demon lord dominating 70% of the world and almost all kingdoms having fallen. The monarch exalts Elialu's role and says she envies her for being the sword that will save the world. Elialu accepts his fate, even though he is very sad, and tries to find reasons to be happy with the situation. The protagonist buys a package of items that increase speed. Rista catches the protagonist's attention, to Elialu, and the protagonist says that it's obvious what she has to do and that he doesn't need to say anything. Elialu says the protagonist is right and runs away. We see a party, and it is said that Elialu has dressed for the ceremony. The goddess, Mash, and the hero are drinking when small draconians appear, offering food. The protagonist does not want to accept, but the goddess insists. The lights go out, and after the protagonist appears, wiping his mouth, Elialu is shown walking towards a cliff. She says goodbye, and the monarch tells her to get lost. Mash wants to stop it, but two guards appear. Elialu begins to be pushed, and despair is seen on the goddess's face. The protagonist kicks the draconians who were pushing Elialu. He says that she is forcing him to say that she is his carrier and that she will not be able to carry like a sword. And there is no guarantee that the sword will be able to defeat the demon lord. The monarch claims that the ancient dragon said it would be, and the protagonist says he doesn't trust the old caterpillar's opinion. Rista starts laughing and says they will save the world without sacrificing friends. Mash transforms but soon falls, and the goddess doesn't even notice and is already down. The monarch said she ordered a paralyzer to be placed in their food and ordered the ceremony to continue. In this, the protagonist kicks the draconian, and after questioning the monarch, he reveals that it didn't work the paralyzer because he didn't even eat. He says that food made by lizards is disgusting. With the statement that he only eats Rista's food, she is very happy. The monarch decides to defeat the protagonist, and he becomes a dragon. At level 66, her hit points are very high, and her dragon scales give extra protection as they are harder than metal. Then, the protagonist takes the dragon-slaying sword from his bag, which he synthesized with a platinum sword and a lock of hair from Elialu, Mash, and 100 strands of Rista. She asks how he got 100 threads, and he says he pulled them out during the night. Rista is furious but decides to leave the matter until after the battle. In battle, the protagonist's first blow draws blood from the dragon monarch, who decides to attack Elialu. The protagonist saves her, then the dragon monarch activates a magic that was on her necklace, which will soon take her life. The protagonist tells the monarch to stop the magic, and she says that the magic will only stop if the protagonist eliminates it. The protagonist goes all out against the dragon, which activates a shield ability. The protagonist consumes the items that increase speed and takes out a second dragon-slaying sword. In Kirito style, he uses the double eternal sword attack. With thousands of attacks per second, it barely does any damage. Elialu gives up, Rista worries. With the dragon monarch boasting, the protagonist pushes her off the cliff. Rista stands up with the protagonist, saying that Elyulu is her precious carrier. The monarch undoes the defense ability and launches fire. The protagonist cuts the fire with the wind blades. The monarch falls into the precipice because her wings are in a sieve. Elyulu is saved. Rista asks when he damaged the monarch's wings, and he tells her that he had already predicted her movements and that before she activated the defense, he had already damaged the wings. A sword emerges from the abyss. The protagonist infuses Elyulu's blood into the sword, says that the legendary sword has emerged, and says that the Draconian's mission has been accomplished. Saying that the monarch wanted to turn the sacred sword, he says that it is a win-win situation for everyone. Upon leaving the village, Elyulu and Mash have a moment of their own, and Rista tells them to go first. The goddess complains about her hair being ripped out and says he took advantage of her. She says he knows that the sword is not the legendary sword and that he did it to keep everyone calm. When they leave the cave, they encounter knights, who ask the protagonist to help. The knights say they took him to the fortress. The protagonist says there is no need, asks for directions, and flies away. The enemy is a fly demon with an army of demonic flies. While Rista is impressed by his level, the hero is impressed by the fact that he speaks with a mouth like a fly. The flies capture attacking riders and release them from high altitude. Mash wants to immediately attack the demon fly, but the hero warns them that they must be cautious due to the fly's speed. When the protagonist meets the remaining knights, Captain Rosalie wants an immediate attack, but after discussing it with a veteran, they decide to develop a strategy. On the way to the fortress, the veteran says that there is an exceptional knight capable of rivaling more powerful demons, but that he cannot leave the capital. The protagonist and his group join Rosalie's meeting and interrupt the discussion with their concerns. The only thing the protagonist agrees with Rosalie is that they don't need a meeting, as he already knows what he should do. When he says that he is leaving to train, everyone is crestfallen. The members of the meeting think he is fearful. Rista explains that it won't be long before he returns, and Rosalie begins to argue with the protagonist. When it seems that the protagonist is going to support the goddess, she is happy, until she is called useless. Upon discovering that the protagonist saw the massacre of the soldiers, Rosalie screams and calls the hero a coward. Rista tries to explain that his way is the right one and that he will exterminate the flies, but Rosalie is stubborn and refutes the goddess by talking about the knights she lost. The protagonist says that Rosalie is the only one who is not able to talk about human lives, as her lack of strategy led to the knights being exterminated. Rosalie gets very angry and tries to hit the protagonist, who defends her and slaps her in the face. Rista says that no matter his reflex, you shouldn't hit a woman, and he says it was self-defense. She tries several times to hit the protagonist but ends up with huge cheeks. And crying, she draws her sword. After Rosalie says that she doesn't need the hero and that she will defeat the fly alone, he looks at her status and says that she will die for nothing. She starts to growl, and the protagonist's group goes to the world of the gods. In the world of the gods, he says he hates her way of going into a battle that she will lose by sacrificing her allies. Afterward, they went to the goddess of the bow, Midas, and Rista asked her to train the protagonist. Midas shows a multiple shot technique at the protagonist's request, and he says he lets her train him. She says he has to know how to use a magic bow and asks Elyulu to teach him the fire bow. And in an instant, the technique is mastered, and training begins immediately. Elyulu gets sad, and Mash wants to train. At that moment, Circe stops by and says that the goddess of war, who trained the protagonist, is crazier than ever. Rista goes to talk to Arya about the situation, and in the middle of the conversation, she identifies dormant powers in Mash and Elyulu and awakens them. Rista goes after the goddess of war and gets scared. When asked about the protagonist, she says he didn't come with her and tries to make up an excuse for being there. The protagonist is shown with the divine ability that the goddess of the bow taught him, and Rista appears, asking him to prevent him from leaving so as not to encounter the goddess of war, but she is after Rista. The goddess of war emanates a sinister aura and says that she will show the original eternal sword. The protagonist starts a normal chat with her, and she forgives him and falls in love with him again. Meanwhile, The goddess of the bow stares at the protagonist with a look of desire. Arya has Mash and Elyulu show their powers to Rista. Mash gets the power to better control her metamorphosis. Elyulu has developed support magic, which can speed up or slow down his target. Having tea with Arya, Rista mentions archery training, and Arya says that Misty's is much worse than the goddess of war and that she is trapped in the divine forest for abusing the heroes that were summoned. He is a nymphomaniac. Rista runs to save the protagonist, thinking that this event should be up to her. Upon arriving, she finds the protagonist staring at Misty's, tied naked to the tree. Rista almost falls into Misty's story, and after an appeal from the goddess of the bow, the protagonist says that the answer is obvious. The protagonist hits Misty's in the head, and Rista freaks out. The goddess breaks free from the ropes and announces that she is going to attack the protagonist and that he is to stop her if he can. The protagonist hits several arrows of light on the goddess, who stops for a moment but soon gets up and decides to attack Mash. After chasing him, she jumps to catch the dragon boy, who is saved by the protagonist by launching 5 arrows of light at the goddess. After the catchphrase, they return to the world to be saved and set out to defeat the demon flies. With the fly demon's attention on Rosalie, who was heading towards the fly's lair, the protagonist prepares to attack the enemy. There, Rista discovers from the protagonists, Mash and Elyulu, that she smells and is attracting flies. With that, one of the knights arrives, shouting, and attracts the attention of the flies. Rosalie is caught by the fly demon, and the protagonist sends Rista to distract him while he tries to resolve the situation. Rista asks to release Rosalie, and when Rosalie complains, she passes information to the villain, who decides to fly higher to avoid the protagonist's attacks. Above the clouds, the villain decides to throw the captain to the ground, and the goddess continues trying to stall. At that moment, the protagonist's arrow reaches the villain, who releases the captain, who is caught by the goddess. The fly demon is very perceptive when analyzing the situation and deduces the protagonist's movements. The protagonist launches 7 arrows of light, which the villain dodges, and he meets the protagonist. Suddenly the villain has no belly. We discover that the protagonist has improved his magic. That the arrows have turned into birds and chased the villain. Rosalie tries to belittle the protagonist's victory. Rista says that she is alive thanks to him, and when Rista tells the protagonist to say something, he says the captain is just a crying puppy. The captain is nervous, and Rista admires her ability to cause so much damage with words. The protagonist says it's time to take care of the other flies. He says he knows that Mash and Elyulu have become stronger, making them both happy. But we soon see the protagonist firing hundreds of arrows per second, wiping out all the flies, and using Elyulu and Mash to collect the flies. In the end, the protagonist sets the insects on fire and receives information about the existence of divine armor. After receiving information about the sacred legendary armor, the protagonist questions whether the armor would be cursed and sacred, but is denied by the princess, who leaves. The protagonist decides to go to the dwarf village, as the armor is nearby. The heroes group finds the village in flames using the goddess magical portal. The hero runs to save the dwarf, who is in front of a huge monster, and then we discover that the dwarf works for the Demon King and that he summoned that monster from another dimension to eat the sacred armor. The goddess is shocked to realize that her hero will not have the sword or sacred armor to help on his journey. All the destruction of the village and the dwarf's own life were used to summon an enemy that the protagonist will not be able to defeat, the hyperconceptual Reaper Thanatos. Before the monster appeared, the protagonist asked the goddess to open a portal to the world from God. The monster appears, and its statistics are not understandable, so the protagonist understands that the monster has far exceeded the limits of power. The hero launches a power that divides the monster and orders the goddess to open the portal again. She doesn't think it's necessary, but now the monster has become 2. The monster hits the protagonist and merges. The hero uses strong fire magic, sends his allies through the portal, and flies into the portal, taking the goddess. She complains about how she was treated but worries about the hero, who seemed to be injured, but it was just a scratch that didn't take away even 1% of his HP. When the goddess says that in the realm of the gods they are safe, the monster enters that dimension. Terrified by the monster's entry, the goddess asks if the super cautious protagonist has already identified the monster's weakness. But he has no idea, and this scares the goddess. At that moment, gods appear to fight with the monster. Several attacks are launched at the monster, which generates enormous destruction. But nothing had any effect. At that moment, the goddess realized that the protagonist was already far away. The Reaper follows the hero's group and defeats the gods that appear to challenge him. Seduces appears with a cake, which ends up in his face. Adenila appears, and the protagonist asks her to defeat the hyperconceptual Reaper. She, super passionate, goes after the monster. The monster is left in pieces. Rista believes it is over, but now there are several monsters that defeat Adenila. The race continues, and the protagonist says he has a plan to defeat monsters he doesn't know how to defeat. Then it says that she usually paints, and then we see the goddess of destruction calmly painting, and the protagonist says that she wouldn't fight if they asked her, and at that moment, he dodges a blow from the Reaper, which destroys her painting. The goddess of destruction becomes enraged and attacks the monster. The monster regenerates and attacks her. She dodges and uses an astral strike. But the monster destroys the astral currents. The goddess laughs, and she unlocks her power limiter. Rista sees her statistics, and they are absurd. The monster casts spells, but everything is blocked. The goddess of destruction uses the power called the Gate of Valhalla, which scares Rista, opening a door that defeats the monster as it transcends the laws of causality. The goddess begins to bleed and warns that the technique uses vital force to defeat the enemy and that humans would lose their lives if they used it. The protagonist understands that the goddess unlocked her power limiter to withstand the burden of the technique. The goddess of destruction goes after Rista, but the protagonist stops her. Rista thinks this is a show of love from the protagonist, but he wants to ask to be trained by the goddess of destruction. Rista says that he cannot learn this technique. The goddess of destruction says that the protagonist would not be able to learn the techniques of destruction. He says to test this statement. So when the goddess of destruction says something about him, he draws his sword and says that she is not supposed to talk about that. After that, she agrees to train him, and the hero's companions go to train, and the protagonist synthesizes a sword with the remains of the sacred armor. Rista hugs the protagonist, who asks her to let him go. She refuses, and then he says that she smells. Scared, she goes to take a shower and meets Seduces, who tells her to go and see the chief goddess. At that moment, we see the conversation between the two, and the chief goddess warns of the huge attack that will happen in the ice sky, but that before going to save that world, Rista should take a shower. The next day, Rista's skin is burned from scrubbing in the shower, and we see that Arya helped the hero's companions become stronger. Then the goddess goes after the protagonist, who is in bed with the goddess of destruction. Rista gets jealous, the hero says it's training, and the goddess of destruction says she can't help it. Rista says that relations between a goddess and a human are prohibited. And the goddess of destruction says that Rista doesn't understand what's happening. Rista starts to whine and shows a little doll she made for the protagonist. When the goddess of destruction realizes that it is made of hair, she is disgusted. Rista's frightening expression makes the goddess of destruction leave her alone. When the hero's companions say that Rista crossed the line, she feels bad and cries on the protagonist's chest, who tells her to stop crying, but the goddess continues and complains about what she just saw, and he says that this was training for a technique of destruction. Rista asks him to swear by God, and he says she is a goddess. Rista says she will believe him and hands over the doll. The protagonist asks Mash to keep the doll. The goddess warns of the danger in the ice sky, and they leave, and at that moment, we hear the thoughts of the goddess, who says that she had not realized the fact that the protagonist had not spoken, that he was perfectly prepared. A battle is about to begin, and the last commander of the Demon King appears and asks for the strongest warrior. A lord in golden armor appears. The demon makes fun of the lord, and the goddess asks the hero to save the lord, but the protagonist says it is not necessary. So the moment the duel begins, you use a sacred blow and win. Rista is surprised, and the man uses another technique, which eliminates all the demons. The goddess and the protagonist are impressed, and the goddess asks why he doesn't participate in the hunt against the Demon King, at which point the man starts to feel sick and becomes a baby. After the surprise, the princess appears to be taking care of the baby, who is her father, so the hero's group goes for a walk in the city, and with excessive caution, he avoids a lot of places. During the discussion, they pass by a bandage seller, which is 3 times more effective than common ones. The protagonist asks for 1,000 of them. The goddess says he doesn't need it, as she can heal him with magic. An argument begins, an injured extra appears. The seller suggests a competition. The goddess goes with all power, but the seller's medicines are more effective. The scene changes, we see the princess asking about the legendary armor, which became monster food. The princess doesn't believe it and says that her father spent the last 30 years battling the Demon King soldiers. She asks the protagonist not to accept that her father goes on the journey with her. The hero says he will deny the elderly man's participation, and the princess thanks him, even though she is irritated by the protagonist's lack of respect. In the scene with the king, the protagonist says from the beginning that he doesn't need his help, and this scares the king. A messenger appears, saying that they are under attack, and the protagonist leaves for the battlefield with his helpers. The goddess stays behind and goes to the cathedral with the king. She keeps muttering about the hero. There, the king asks if the goddess knows why the gods live forever. She says she doesn't know, and the king explains that the soul that is in the goddess's body is a virtual soul and that the real soul is protected in the divine realm, in a place where time does not pass. The same goes for the hero, who, if he loses his life in the ice sky, will only return to his world. The goddess says he knows a lot, and the king looks for an item. Then he takes out a sword equipped with the current of destruction, which is capable of destroying the real soul that is linked to the virtual soul. The goddess realizes that her existence is no longer guaranteed. The king says he will eliminate her, so that the hero cannot go to the world of the gods. Rista asks why he did that, and the elder says that the Demon King offered what he wanted, so the elder became a subordinate of the Demon King. The elderly man uses his power on the goddess, who is captured and is about to be finished. She begins to cry and asks for the protagonist's help. In the final moments, an attack disrupts the king. The princess doesn't believe what she saw, and the protagonist leaves with everything, telling Rista to run away so he can return to the house later. Elialu says that the protagonist was worried about the goddess and decided to appear there. The king asks if the hero has any ability to see the future, and the protagonist says he only explores the possibilities. Showing so many maybes in one sentence leaves Rista in awe. The king laughs at the protagonist's caution. After even threatening the princess, the king eats a demonic orb and becomes much more powerful, becoming a young demon. An intense battle takes place, and many sword powers are released. Then the king starts to boast, and the protagonist starts taking a bunch of weights off his arms and picks up his second platinum sword. The protagonist activates sword skills and resumes the duel. Rista can't keep up with the movement. The king says he has adapted. The goddess asks Elialu to cast a speed-increasing spell on the protagonist, but she already cast it before they arrived on the scene. At that moment, Rista realizes that the hero didn't say he was perfectly prepared. The princess and Mash want to join the battle, but the protagonist won't let them. The king raises dust and starts laughing. The protagonist goes up and loses an arm, and the king attacks the protagonist, who defends himself. The king does not believe that the hero is enduring the pain and retreats, saying that the hero will not win with just one arm. At that moment the protagonist activates a destruction ability, which reflects the damage received. They have one last clash, and the king loses. The goddess heals the protagonist, and the king, who returns to normal, complains about the pain. The hero tells the princess to take care of her father, but she doesn't want to, as he allied himself with the Demon King, so the protagonist asks the goddess to heal the king, gives the princess a punishment, and tells her to talk to her father while he is still alive. 3 days later, the king left because of old age, and the protagonist, after punishing the goddess who called him her servant, tells his companions to rest before training to defeat the Demon King. We see the cautious heroes group happy to be able to have fun for the first time, and the goddess says she will take them to have fun. They will buy new clothes. The goddess discovers that there is mixed bathing in the hot springs and decides to win over the protagonist. The goddess complains about the outdated design of the swimwear, and the saleswoman listens, so she brings a bikini model without the top and leaves the goddess embarrassed and then angry. The seller is more debauched and shows a bikini that exposes one side of her chest. Rista gets even angrier, and the saleswoman compares it to an eye patch. Mash tries to calm the goddess, who tells him to choose shorts for the protagonist. The saleswoman asks if the protagonist is Rista's boyfriend, and she says yes. Mash and Elyulu try to oppose it, but they can't. The seller offers a pair of swim trunks with the front open, and the goddess decides to buy them. The seller, who is also the one who sewed these clothes, doesn't believe she's going to sell them and is happy. After that, the heroes group goes to buy food and goes to the castle. In the castle, the goddess plans her intimate moment with the protagonist, but when she enters the room, she doesn't find him. The goddess starts to worry, but Mash and Elyulu say he must be getting ready. At nightfall, the heroes group goes looking for him, but no matter where they go, no one sees the protagonist. Elyulu wonders if he went to defeat the Demon King alone. The goddess thinks he is too cautious for that. Not knowing what to do, Rista returns to the kingdom of the gods to locate the protagonist. Upon entering the chief goddess's room, she finds Arya, who is crying. Arya takes Rista to the chief goddess. We see the Tree of Worlds in the room where time doesn't pass, and the chief goddess says that the protagonist went straight to face the Demon King. Rista says he wouldn't do that, mainly because the Demon King can destroy true souls. The chief goddess explains that he did this to protect Rista. Rista says that he has always despised her, and the chief goddess says that despite his behavior, he has always been at the forefront of protecting his friends and saving the world. The chief goddess tells about the protagonist's motivations, and says that his actions were to keep his companions away from danger. Rista says that the hero could have returned to the divine realm and trained, and the chief goddess says that the protagonist has been in your level cap. Rista regrets not knowing about the protagonist's anguish and says that the hero could beat a Demon King from an S-rank world with these statistics. But the fact that he didn't have the sacred sword or the sacred armor made him decide to learn the techniques of destruction, even the final technique, which takes the warrior's life in the process. At that moment, the chief goddess says that he is seeking redemption for his past, which Rista doesn't understand. Then we see a memory of Arya. 100 years in the past, the protagonist had been summoned to save a B-rank world. He was extremely optimistic, and he wasn't prepared for anything. We see a duel in which the protagonist's companions suffer damage, and the hero himself is left with almost no life points and a hole in his chest. But in the end, they win. Arya says that the protagonist never prepared, he just moved forward, and thanks to his incredible battle skills, no one was worried. We see the moment when all that remains is for the Demon King to be defeated, and the protagonist decides to go without obtaining more information. In the fight, we see the hero using the sacred sword and defeating the villain. The wizard in his group has no more mana, and everyone is relieved. But then the Demon King resurrects and devours the wizard, then devours the goddess, becoming stronger. The group's healer is also without magic, and after the protagonist tells her to run, the frog captures her. Without strength, the protagonist discovers from the Demon King that the healer is pregnant with his child. The hero begs for their lives, and the memories end. At that moment, the chief goddess says that the healer was the goddess Rista in her other life. Rista starts to cry, and the chief goddess says that this experience was recorded in the protagonist's soul, even though he doesn't remember the events. Fate made her summon her love from another life, and when he said property instead of status, he realized that he had already been summoned in the past and that it had been a failure. Rista wants to go to the protagonist. Arya tells her to stay, and the chief goddess says that the power to destroy gods is a justification for her to give up this mission. But Rista opens a portal directly into the Demon King's castle, which goes beyond her assignments, and Mash and Elyaloo follow her. The heroes group arrives, and soon they hear the sound of a duel. The protagonist is alone, dueling against the Demon King. At that moment, he puts away his sword and activates the destruction technique. Rista tries to stop him. But the Demon King is already captured by the technique. The villain complains that he has an anti-magic field, and the protagonist explains that this is not magic. The doors of the technique were closing, but the Demon King transformed and began to open them. The heroes group is scared. The villain says that this can only be a joke, and the protagonist says he predicted that he would try to escape the technique. He launches a fire attack with his sword, but it is not effective. He takes a hit and counterattacks with a sequence of sword blows. The villain laughs and says that only the sacred sword can cause damage, but then he feels the attack. We see the goddess's hair doll being used in the synthesis. The protagonist used the thorns of the destruction technique. Now he has a sword that causes damage to the villain. The hero hits the Demon King and pushes him into the technique, which then closes. The protagonist is suffering collateral damage from the technique, and the goddess is complaining to him. She cries and says everything she wants to do, then asks them to release all their power. The chief goddess warns that Rista could lose her position as a goddess if she goes through with this. Rista doesn't care, receives the powers, and starts to heal the hero, but the more she heals, the more he gets hurt. She says that this time it will be a happy ending, and the protagonist wakes up. She goes in for the kiss but is rejected. For a while, she continues trying for a kiss, until he pushes her away by force. Elyaloo warns that the technique is still in place. The Demon King breaks part of the door and says that he will take the world with him. Rista turns pale and confirms that everything can be destroyed, so the hero uses a stronger version of the destruction technique that almost took his life. The technician says that he has successfully destroyed the villain and that he will now receive his payment. The goddess says she won't let him, but the protagonist is falling apart. Rista uses all her power, but even so, his destruction is faster than her healing. Elyaloo tells them to go to the realm of the gods to save the protagonist's soul. Rista says she can't stop healing the protagonist for a moment. At that moment, the hero thanks Elyaloo and asks Mash to protect this world. He tells Rista that it's enough and hugs her. She apologizes for being useless, and then he remembers his other adventure, is glad he saved her this time and disappears. We see Rista talking to the princess, and the princess says that the protagonist is a true hero. The goddess says that an ordinary hero could not have saved this world. Rista meets with Mash and Elyaloo, and they both promise to protect the world. Elyaloo asks the goddess to visit them. We see the goddess leaving. In her house, she imagines the protagonist, and then she runs looking for him. We see the goddess sad. In her bed, Arya appears and says that the chief goddess called her. Arya begins to fix Rista, who says she accepts the punishment for breaking divine orders. Arya says she will guarantee a light punishment, as she saved an S-rank world. Adelina appears to cheer Rista up, then Circeus offers her a cake. An argument ensues about whether the cake is protein or not, and Midas appears, saying that protein is necessary to make someone attractive. After that, the goddess of destruction appears, congratulates Rista, and says she does not regret teaching the hero the techniques. We see the chief goddess congratulating Rista on her achievement and telling her what punishment she has chosen for her. Arya defends her friend, and Rista's punishment is to save the SS rank world. That world was where the protagonist had failed, and Rista goes to that world with her power sealed. Arya says that the punishment is huge and that it is impossible to save a world with such conditions. Then the chief goddess says that it is possible. Arya gets angry and asks which hero can save a world like that, but apologizes. The chief goddess says that the effect of the artifact that destroys souls was swallowed by the protagonist's technique. Rista widens her eyes, and the chief goddess says that normally a hero who fails a world cannot return to it, but she has made an exception. With his stats reset, the protagonist will be able to save the world that he once was unable to. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel until the next video.